Welcome back. Are you ready to dive into the world of Dostoevsky with me?
Always up for a good psychological thriller.
Today we're looking at notes from Underground, with your excerpt specifically.
Okay.
Really trying to understand this narrator, right? This underground man.
Yeah, he's quite a character, isn't he?
He is. So
Yeah.
tell me, when you first encountered his voice, what was your reaction?
Well, he comes right out and calls himself, a sick man, a wicked man. It's almost like he's daring you to dislike him right from the start.
He does, and yet there's this strange sense of humor, too. It's dark, but it's there.
Yeah.
Like that line about his toothache. What was it? There is also pleasure in a toothache. I mean,
Yeah. Right. It's like he finds some weird satisfaction in his own misery.
exactly. So how do we make sense of that?
Well, I think Dostoevsky is using that to highlight this need for agency that the underground man has. He's rebelling against this idea that happiness is the be-all and end-all of existence.
Okay, so even suffering for him can be a form of control.
In a way, yes. He'd rather choose to be miserable than be told how to be happy. Which brings us to that phrase he uses, conscious inertia.
Yes. It's such a contradiction.
It is, and I think that's the point. He's rejecting the dominant philosophies of his time. Utilitarianism, rational egoism, all these ideas that preached reason and progress.
But he sees them as what? Too simplistic.
Exactly. He sees them as ignoring the chaotic reality of what it means to be human.
So he'd rather be authentically miserable than artificially content.
Right. He's clinging to his individuality even if it makes him suffer.
Which is fascinating, because then he goes on about the normal man, right? The one who just goes through life without overthinking it.
Right. He seems to envy them, but also look down on them at the same time.
It's like this weird tension within him. Why do you think that is?
It goes back to free will, I think. The normal man might be content, but he's predictable. The underground man, for all his misery, he still has the freedom to choose.
Even if those choices lead him down a dark path.
Even then, he'd rather be a conscious suffering being than a blissful automaton.
I think it's getting even more interesting for me in the second part of the book. You highlighted these interactions with the officer, and then Liza Wright is like he goes from these big ideas about suffering and freedom, and then bam, he has to deal with actual people.
And we get to see how those ideas actually play out in his life. How does he handle real human connection? Or how does he handle rejection?
Well, let's start with that officer, the one he bumps into.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have to admit, when I first read that, I thought, come on. You're telling me you've never been there, overthinking some tiny interaction, wondering if you offended someone or like what they really meant when they said
Oh,
something.
absolutely. We've all been there. But for the underground man, it's not just a passing thought. It becomes this huge thing in his mind, like he can't let it go.
Exactly. So what makes it different for him then?
I think it goes back to his obsession with social status. He's so self-conscious, so worried about how others perceive him, that this little bump becomes like a major insult in his head.
Like it confirms all of his worst fears about himself.
And it reveals this paradox, right? He wants to be authentic. He wants to be free. But he's also trapped by his ego, by these social anxieties.
And then we have Liza.
Oh, Liza.
This section is always really tough for me to read, I have to say. How about you?
It's intense. Because on the one hand, you have the underground man trying to save Liza.
Right, with his words.
With his words, exactly. But he ends up doing the opposite. He just dumps all of his negativity and cynicism onto her.
Like he's trying to convince her that life is just suffering and there's no escaping it.
And it's heartbreaking because Liza represents this genuine connection, a chance for him to step outside of himself, and he just pushes her away.
He can't handle it.
It's like he's terrified of vulnerability, terrified of what it would mean to actually let someone in.
Yeah, and that image of her at the end, 15 years later, it's still haunting him.
Yeah, right.
It's like this reminder that he can't escape the consequences of his actions, no matter how much he tries to intellectualize them away. We've really gotten into the weeds of this guy, haven't we? The underground man.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in his head.
But there's this phrase that you highlighted in the excerpts, and it stuck with me, living life.
Yeah.
What do you think Dostoevsky is getting at there? Because it seems like the underground man himself is struggling with what that even means.
Well, and that's the question, isn't it? What does it actually mean to live life? Dostoevsky doesn't give us any easy answers.
No, he doesn't.
He's more interested in exploring the complexities, I think.
Because even the underground man, right? He talks about the normal man going through life blindly, but then he's still stuck in his own head all the time. It's like neither extreme is the answer.
Exactly. Maybe that's precisely the point Dostoevsky is making. Living life isn't about finding this perfect formula, whether that's blind faith or pure intellect. It's about that messy in between, embracing all of it.
Acknowledging our capacity for reason, but also our very human need for connection, for feeling.
Exactly. It's about holding those two things together without falling into the traps of self-sabotage or denial.
So where does that leave us as readers?
Right.
I mean, we finished the book, and yet we're still wrestling with these questions.
Well, maybe that's the mark of a great writer, isn't it? Dostoevsky gives us this challenge. Can we learn from the underground man's mistakes? Can we find that balance in our own lives? Can we live life without retreating into the underground of our own minds?
Big questions. And I have to say, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Sure. My pleasure. It's always fun to dig into Dostoevsky.
And for our listeners, if you're looking to explore more of Dostoevsky's work, we highly recommend checking out some of his other novels like Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov. Each one offers a unique perspective on the human condition. But most importantly, keep those questions coming. Keep seeking, keep living life to the fullest, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.